Silence is rarely accidental. When something truly ends, it fades naturally. People move on, details blur, and the story settles into memory without resistance. But when a story refuses to rest, when it lingers, unsettles, and quietly returns, again and again, it's usually because something was never fully said. There are moments in history that were declared closed far too quickly. Official conclusions were reached, headlines were written, and public attention shifted. And yet, beneath the surface, an unease remained. Not loud enough to spark outrage, not clear enough to demand correction, just persistent enough to be felt. This isn't the discomfort of mystery. It's the discomfort of incomplete truth. Some events don't haunt us because they are unsolved. They haunt us because they were solved too cleanly. Over time, people stop asking what happened and start asking something else entirely. Why did everyone stop talking? Silence doesn't arrive all at once. It forms gradually. One voice steps back. Another chooses caution. Someone decides it's not worth it. A journalist moves on to the next story. A witness convinces themselves their memory isn't reliable. A detail that once felt important is quietly removed from the conversation. And eventually, what remains is a shared understanding that this subject is no longer welcome, not forbidden, just inconvenient. What makes this silence so unsettling is that it rarely feels natural. It feels agreed upon, not through meetings or instructions, but through instinct. People sense the invisible boundaries and adjust accordingly. Questions soften. Language becomes vague. Certainty replaces curiosity. And the story becomes smaller than it once was. This kind of silence doesn't protect the truth. It protects stability. Because truth, when it complicates the narrative, demands effort. It demands discomfort. It demands that people admit they don't fully understand what they thought they did. And for institutions, media, and even individuals, that admission carries a cost. So instead, the silence grows. At first, it feels respectful. Then it feels responsible. Eventually, it feels normal. But normal does not mean honest. Human beings are wired to seek patterns. When something doesn't fit, the mind notices, even if the mouth stays shut. And when millions of people feel the same quiet tension around a single story, that tension becomes cultural. It lingers beneath conversations, resurfacing in documentaries, late-night debates, and online forums. Not because people want conspiracy, but because they want coherence. And coherence cannot exist where pieces are missing. In stories like these, the most important clues are often not the loudest ones. They are the absences, the pauses, the moments where something should have been said, but wasn't. Consider how quickly narratives solidify after tragedy. Within days, sometimes hours, explanations are offered. Language becomes definitive. Words like clearly, undoubtedly, and case closed appear long before understanding has time to mature. This urgency isn't malicious. It's human. Uncertainty is unsettling. Ambiguity invites anxiety. And tragedy, when left unexplained, feels unbearable, so we rush to meaning. We accept conclusions not because they are perfect, but because they are available. And once a conclusion is accepted publicly, challenging it becomes socially expensive. Those who question are labeled insensitive. Those who probe are accused of exploiting pain. Those who hesitate are seen as disrespectful, so people learn to stay quiet. This is how silence becomes self-reinforcing. The less something is questioned, the more inappropriate questioning feels. Over time, even valid concerns begin to sound like disruptions rather than inquiries. And the story remains frozen. But frozen stories don't heal. They preserve tension. The real issue is not whether the official explanation is right or wrong. The issue is whether it answers the questions people actually feel. And often, it does not, because official explanations are built to conclude. Human understanding is built to explore. When those two goals conflict, silence fills the gap. Another reason silence takes hold is fear not always of consequences, but of uncertainty itself. When people begin to question a story they once accepted, they risk destabilizing their own beliefs. And belief systems, once shaken, demand rebuilding. It's easier to leave the foundation untouched. This is especially true when the story involves figures who have already been transformed into symbols. Once a person becomes an icon, their life is no longer treated as complex. It becomes representative. And representative figures are not allowed ambiguity. Ambiguity weakens symbols, and culture protects its symbols fiercely. So nuance is sacrificed. Details that don't align with the preferred narrative are minimized. Context is trimmed. Contradictions are reframed as irrelevant. Over time, the story becomes smooth but shallow, and shallow stories don't satisfy. They quiet the surface while leaving the depths unsettled. Another layer of silence comes from proximity. People closest to an event often speak the least, not because they know the least, but because they know too much. Memory is heavy. Loyalty complicates honesty, and grief distorts language. Sometimes silence is protection. Sometimes it is exhaustion. Sometimes it is survival. Not every quiet person is hiding something. Some are simply tired of being asked questions they cannot answer without reopening wounds. But when all of these silences align, media silence, institutional silence, personal silence, they create something larger than any individual choice. They create a void. And humans are drawn to voids. We return to them, we circle them, we attempt to fill them with interpretation. And when official narratives don't provide room for that exploration, alternative narratives emerge. Not necessarily because they are accurate, but because they acknowledge the gap. People don't chase hidden meanings for entertainment. They chase them because something feels unfinished. And unfinished stories demand attention. This is why certain events never fully leave public consciousness. They resurface every few years, not as accusations, but as questions. New generations encounter the same story and feel the same discomfort. They notice the same missing pieces. They ask the same things their predecessors were quietly discouraged from asking. And the cycle continues. The most telling aspect of these stories is not what is debated, it is what is avoided. Pay attention to which questions are framed as inappropriate, which angles are dismissed without examination, which details are labeled irrelevant without explanation. Avoidance is rarely accidental. When a topic becomes taboo without being dangerous, it's usually because it threatens comfort, not safety. Silence in these cases is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of pressure. Pressure to move on. Pressure to accept. Pressure to stop looking. But history shows us that pressure does not erase truth. It only delays it. Eventually, the silence cracks, not always through revelation, but through persistence. Through stories that refuse to stay buried. Through people who were not there when the rules of silence were established, because silence has a lifespan, and curiosity outlives it. What remains, then, is not a demand for a different conclusion, but a demand for a fuller one. An acknowledgement that human lives are rarely reducible to single explanations. That endings are often messier than headlines allow. And that silence, no matter how widespread, is not the same as resolution. This is where reflection begins. Not with accusation, not with certainty, but with the recognition that some stories deserve more space than they were given. And that asking why people went quiet is not an act of disrespect. It is an act of attention. Silence is not only created by what is withheld. It's shaped by how things are said. Media doesn't need to lie to influence perception. It only needs to choose its words carefully. Language frames reality long before facts are evaluated. And once a frame is accepted, everything that doesn't fit inside begins to feel out of place, even if it is true. After major events, media narratives tend to converge quickly. Early descriptions become templates. Later reporting rarely challenges those foundations. It reinforces them. This isn't due to coordination, but convenience. Once a dominant version exists, deviating from it requires justification, and justification requires risk. So stories stabilize. Look closely at the vocabulary used when sensitive stories are discussed. Words like tragic but inevitable, troubled, or long struggle appear frequently. These phrases feel empathetic, but they also close doors. They discourage deeper examination by implying that everything unfolded exactly as expected. Language becomes a soft barrier. Questions aren't rejected outright. They are absorbed, diluted, and reframed until they lose their edge. Instead of asking why, coverage shifts to how it made people feel. Instead of investigating circumstances, it focuses on legacy. Reflection replaces examination. This is not accidental. Legacy is safe. Circumstance is volatile. When the conversation centers on remembrance, it subtly discourages scrutiny. To question details begins to feel like an attack on memory rather than an attempt at understanding. And most people don't want to be seen as disrespectful, especially in matters involving loss. So they choose silence. Over time, this creates a feedback loop. Media avoids hard questions because audiences seem uninterested. Audiences appear uninterested because media no longer asks the questions. And the absence of inquiry is mistaken for consensus. But consensus achieved through omission is fragile. Another powerful tool in the construction of silence is finality. Once a story is labeled closed, reopening it feels unnecessary, or worse, irresponsible. Closure language implies completion, even when understanding remains partial. Words like final, confirmed, and definitive carry weight far beyond evidence. They signal that discussion has an expiration date. And once that date passes, continued curiosity is framed as obsession rather than engagement. This discourages nuance. People begin to self-censor, not because they lack questions, but because they lack permission to ask them. And permission is rarely granted explicitly. It is inferred through tone, repetition, and absence. Silence, in this sense, is taught. Another layer of quiet emerges from authority. When official statements are delivered confidently, they establish hierarchy. Expertise speaks, the public listens. And disagreement is interpreted as ignorance rather than inquiry. But authority is not infallibility, and confidence is not completeness. Yet challenging authority requires more than doubt. It requires access, credibility, and endurance. Most individuals possess none of these in sufficient quantity, so they retreat inward, carrying their questions privately. Private doubt doesn't disappear. It accumulates. This accumulation eventually surfaces, not as organized opposition, but as scattered unease. People may not articulate what feels wrong, but they recognize that something doesn't sit comfortably. And discomfort seeks expression. In the absence of official space for questioning, alternative spaces emerge. Independent platforms, online communities, documentaries. These spaces are not inherently unreliable, but they are often dismissed as such by default. Not because they are wrong, but because they exist outside approved channels. This dismissal reinforces the divide between acceptable curiosity and problematic curiosity. One is welcomed, the other is pathologized. And silence deepens. Another factor contributing to collective quiet is repetition. When a single narrative is repeated often enough, it becomes familiar. Familiarity breeds acceptance, not through persuasion, but through fatigue. People stop questioning, not because they are convinced, but because they are tired. Tired of hearing the same arguments. Tired of feeling unsettled. Tired of standing alone in doubt, so they let the narrative pass. But repetition cannot erase contradiction. It only buries it temporarily. And buried contradictions have a way of resurfacing, often unexpectedly. This is why decades-old stories continue to provoke discussion. Not because new evidence has emerged, but because old explanations never fully satisfied. Time does not validate incomplete narratives. It exposes their limits. Perhaps the most responsible way to approach these stories is not to seek finality, but to preserve openness, to resist the urge to simplify, to acknowledge ambiguity without exploiting it. This isn't a call to doubt everything. It's a call to question respectfully, to recognize that curiosity is not a threat to truth, but a companion to it. Some stories ask to be remembered, others ask to be examined, and some, the rare ones, ask both. They remain present not because they are mysterious, but because they reflect something unresolved within us. Our discomfort with pain, our relationship with fame, our need to categorize lives into narratives that make sense. But not all lives make sense, and not all endings offer closure. That doesn't make them failures. It makes them real. In the end, the most enduring stories are not those with answers, but those with echoes. They linger because they challenge how we listen, how we remember, and how we assign meaning. They remind us that understanding is not an event. It is a process, and some processes never truly end. Not because the truth is unreachable, but because it is layered. And layers require time. Thank you for watching.